Yes, he did.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Hey, thanks for joining us for another edition of Donnybrook. Good to have you with us. We have a lot of topics to kick around for this edition of the program. And also later today, we're going to be talking about Metrolink. And with us, we're going to be talking to Taulby Roach, who is the head, the president, and the CEO of Bi-State Development. But first, let's meet the panelists, starting with Wendy Wiese. She's the news director for the Big 550 KTRS, along with Mr. Bill McClellan from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Ray Hartmann from, he was reading, folks, the Riverfront Times and KTRS, and Alvin Reid from the Big 590, as well as the St. Louis American and 97.1 FM News Talk. But a big shout out before we begin to Ben Tinsley from our Zoom team who's celebrating a birthday today. Ben, have the best of days. I hope you got our gift. If not, it's still in the mail. Many, many happy returns. Okay, Bill McClellan. I want to ask you about, again, the McCloskeys, the Central West End gun-toting couple, still in the news, these many weeks after they were, I guess, brandishing firearms in front of demonstrators who were walking by their palatial manse. As it turns out, they have been investigated by the circuit attorney. Their attorney, Al Watkins, handed over some of the firearms to authorities. Turns out that the revolver that Mrs. McCloskey was wielding was not operable. I thought that was curious. Now, the junior senator from the great state of Missouri, Senator Hawley, wants a civil rights investigation into the circuit attorney's office because she's looking into their firearms. And now Congressman Lacey Clay has blasted Josh Hawley for abusing the civil rights laws. What do you make of this, Bill?
Well, for once I'm on Kim Gardner's side in the sense that I think a civil rights investigation of her investigation would be crazy. But 2 weeks ago, I said on this show that I wish she wouldn't prosecute just because, this is like a Scobes monkey trial. I mean, the more this stays in the news and people watch us and they go, who are those people from St. Louis? What are they doing? And Josh Hawley calling for investigation, and that brings the U.S. Attorney's Office into play, Jeff Johnson. It's just way too much. The region really can't keep sustaining these kind of blows forever.
I think you can guarantee you there are people sitting down writing checks to Hawley's re-election campaign based on his defense of the Second Amendment, based on the fact that we have certainly seen Kim Gardner in many cases where she goes after, she selectively is going after one group when she doesn't seem to have the same sense of urgency about another. Clearly, Hawley is grandstanding and he is getting ready for his next election, but I think he's going to find it pretty effective in some quarters.
Well, I think Kim Gardner, first of all, the idea that there's no possible violation when you are pointing firearms, loaded or unloaded, at people on the street. Now, again, it hasn't been established whether were threatening them, but just people walking down your street, you cannot just point firearms at them. So for Kim Gardner to investigate that, which is all she's done, is absolutely her job, regardless of what you think about how else she's done her job. I do think there might be a role for the Attorney General, and that is Joe Biden's Attorney General looking into a conspiracy by Josh Hawley for interfering with the work of an officer of the law, officer of the court, which is Kim Gardner, because the idea
we can keep this going for 3 years, right?
Yeah, but well, look, this is like relentless pursuit that you put on people who are, organized crime figures. What is in the McCluskey's house that you would serve a search warrant on their house. That's all I'm saying. I'm just like, now listen, do you think that they have got a cache of weapons in there, or they got dope in there, or they got illegal aliens in there? Just, what are you doing? Okay, that's the only problem I have with this. Let it go. Bill's right. Just let this go. I will say this. The governor made this same grandstand at some press conference a few days ago, and then they were asking the governor about the details of what actually happened on Portland Place that day, and he had absolutely no idea. Now, I don't think the McCloskeys broke any law based upon our laws in Missouri, but for Josh Hawley, shut up. And for the governor, who has no idea what happened, to be pontificating, shut up. And Kim Gardner, let's move on.
Let's move on because
Hawley and Gardner are playing to their bases.
I agree.
You guys are
that's so I don't know if the McCloskeys are using them or if they are using the McCloskeys.
You know what? The McCloskeys are using all of us, and so is Kim Gardner and Josh Hawley and the media. It's the biggest irrelevant non-story.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
A 6-year-old died yesterday from a gunshot wound, and what are we doing? We're going after this silly Central West End Brooks brother pink shirt wearing couple that never even shot anybody. We should be ashamed of ourselves, and I regret bringing up the topic. Let's move on to the second topic. Governor Greitens was having, I guess, a dinner at Vito's, an Italian restaurant that we used to hang out at quite a bit, gang, when he heard some gunshots in front of the big church at St. Louis University, and he rushed. He applied a tourniquet. His dining companion applied CPR. Unfortunately, those there did not survive. It was another terrible shooting just a couple of blocks from KETC. 2 gentlemen died. I got to say, I know the governor, ex-governor, has a lot of baggage, Wendy, but in this case, I got to say that he's a hero. He responded to the scene of the crime and did what he had to do and tried to do. He took his Navy SEAL training and put it into practice. What do you say?
I think that anytime that anybody calls our colleague here, Bill McClellan, a hero for his time served in the military, he always defers that label. And I think that Governor Greitens, I would hope, I didn't hear any subsequent interviews with him, but I would hope he would defer that. He was simply being a good citizen. We have been at Vito's many times in the past. We know how far away it is from the corner of Grand and Lendl. And I just think he must have ears like a dolphin or a bat, or because I don't know that I would have been able to discern gunfire and, race and all of that. And this is the second time, I believe, his former wife, remember, their proximity to newsworthy stories and coverage on, I believe most of the time it's Fox 2, that gets there first, but his wife was carjacked behind St. Louis, the U-High, or somewhere near the campus. So I think that what he did was certainly commendable. I just think his hearing should probably be studied by experts.
I think there's an old saying that says, "Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on." I got it backwards. Shame on you.
Oh, you're right.
Okay. But in this case, it's lie to me 12 times. Don't talk to me about the 13th. I mean, I just don't know. I inherently, and it's not a political statement. I mean, if you want to vote for Josh Hawley, fine. He just happened to show up with, his little photo op with the mask that didn't work. He's trying so hard to get attention. It's just hard to know whether.
And it's cynical. You were both too cynical.
No matter what your politics are, I mean,
if he did it good,
he did try to
commendable.
Good first aid.
I'm saying he did it good, but I'm very skeptical.
You can't stage a murder. Two guys died. Their van was riddled with bullets. Why are you skeptical?
Nobody said anything about that, Charlie.
You're questioning his hearing and all that. He has to have super hearing.
The murder was real, Charlie. What Greitens' role in it, he served his country as a Navy SEAL. Good for him. I'm just saying, I'm just a little skeptical.
I would just like to have. I'm going to go Law and Order. I would like to have been there and have a timeline. That's all I'm going to say. You know what?
Oh my goodness.
helping the victims, tip of the cap. But
okay, Alvin,
how you got to
you then?
All right.
Let's stick with you, Alvin. Chief John Hayden this week in an interview with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch said that the morale of the cops are really low. And you can understand that. They're working long 12-hour shifts. They're already 124 officers short of a full complement. And, covering the protests and the civil unrest has not been a day at the beach. 4 of them have been shot, as a matter of fact, and 2 on Sunday were injured outside of City Hall. What do you make of John Hayden's comments?
Don't like it. You're the chief, and you're the chief of morale. And listen, it's a tough job, but there are a lot of tough jobs. And as the boss, this is when you have to say, look, if we've got internal problems or you've got problems with me based upon, like job stuff, not on the street, but internally, okay, I won't say, suck it up, all right? We'll figure it out. But as far as what your job is, for you to come out like morale is low and all this, listen, the people that you're dealing with, all right, whether you love them, hate them, whatever, the last thing you want to tell them is, I've got a lot of police officers out there whose hearts aren't in their jobs. That was a mistake. I think it shows once again, I think we should have hired a chief that was not from St. Louis and was not familiar with St. Louis or the players in St. Louis. And I think it played out right then. This is listen, we're strong, we're brave, and we aren't shying away from what is going on at this particular moment in time. And unfortunately, I think the chief said just the opposite.
Well, I think there's something to be said for the truth, though. I mean, if you're the chief and you think that morale is terrible, why pretend otherwise? Well, I mean, maybe for a football coach, you got to tell the guys we're going to come out and we're going to do well in the second half. But this is real life, and I think if morale's bad, the chief ought to be able to say morale's bad.
I think there's something to be said for the timing. Yesterday, Governor Parson announced there's going to be a special session talking about crime. One of the issues they want to bring up, which Chief Hayden and Ida Cruz's support, is getting rid of the residency requirement for police. And I think that this was a way to message that. I happen to agree, by the way, with getting rid of the residency requirement for the police, but I've always believed it should be a matter of local control. Last night on my show, a Republican, Shemet Dogan from Baldwin, had a great idea that I hadn't thought of, and that is make it so that no municipality or unit of government can have a residency requirement, so that you're not single out St. Louis, and then I think it makes sense to get rid of it.
Well, trust me, Ladue doesn't have one.
Well,
I still think that's something local people should work on. Ray,
I don't. Yeah. I think Shemet's right. I think getting rid of the residency is fine, but not over the objection of the Board of Aldermen, unless you're going to do it for everybody.
Getting back to the chief, though, in his statements, I think Bill is right. He's the face of the rank and file, and if there is a serious issue, you don't want anybody out there blowing smoke or making a really awful situation seem like, oh no, everybody's fine. Especially when these are life and death situations that these officers find themselves in. So I respectfully disagree with my colleague, Mr. Reid.
Well, I'll say this. Listen, I don't want a chief that's telling the people that I have to deal with, especially the complete outlaws, that my morale is down, because that will build them up. Like, all we got to do is challenge them, and they'll back off or run away or do whatever.
I got to tell you guys, it is a tough job. They are out in front of the
wait, hold it, Charlie. I never ever said it was not a tough job.
It's the toughest job.
I didn't say, I'm not disagreeing with that, but it's your job, okay?
Yeah, how about a little sympathy for the police officers on the streets?
Charlie, police morale is bad right now at just about every department in the country, and it's part of the process we're going through. If we're going to reimagine, I'm not talking about defunding, we're going to reconstruct the relationship between police and not only communities of color, but really everybody. then we're going to go through a process. And I think it's difficult for everybody right now. I think police departments all over the country are hurting and have bad morale. I don't think St. Louis is any particular exception, but I think it's a necessary part of getting to the other side of having better police.
Okay. Ray, hold on, because I want to talk about a police officer. His name is Keith Wildhaber. And of course, he's the guy who won a $20 million discrimination suit against St. Louis County. He was awarded $20 million this past year when it was determined that the county had discriminated against him because of his sexuality. He later was promoted to a diversity desk job where he would oversee diversity and inclusion. And just 5 months later, there's already friction. Heather Taylor from the Ethical Society of Police and Lieutenant Wildhaber are going back and forth, suggesting that maybe he is not the right guy for the diversity job. And of course, they're going back and forth. She's saying that he's lying. I am actually just a little disappointed that our leaders argue so much, and there was no honeymoon for the guy. Couldn't he at least have 1 year of doing the job before people complained about how bad he is for that role?
Yes, and me. I want to yield my time to McClellan because Bill has said before about this, and I don't want to. First of all, Heather Taylor has every right to speak up, and normally obviously the Keith Wildhaber's case, which was a great embarrassment to everyone in the county with regard to the LGBT community and discrimination against it, was clear. I think as a broader matter, there's more diversity inclusion issues around race, and I think Heather Taylor had every right to speak up for them.
Well, the police department created a make-believe job. Shame on them. And the new lieutenant took it. Shame on him. I mean, if the case was that he should have been named a lieutenant and years went by and he wouldn't get the job and he was qualified and now they're finally going to give it to him, let him be a real lieutenant. Let him have a sergeant and patrolman and be a real lieutenant in police instead of saying, oh, we're going to create a diversity job. Why don't you check in with the chief every month or so?
I agree. And I think this stems from who the chief is, the current chief, because you had a black candidate for the job who was more qualified than the white woman who got it. So if you've got a problem kind of at the top, well, maybe you should take it to the top. I don't know that it should be handled in the diversity department. But I'm with you, Charlie. I'm like, what is this fight about? He hasn't proven himself to be, not able to do the job or do the job spectacularly. So I think this still goes back to who the chief is, not who the officer of diversity is.
I think this kind of predates Mary Barton's appointment, but I know what you're saying, Alvin. Obviously, there's enough of the discord and dissension in the ranks to go around. And I think Heather Taylor's point was well made. When she said we have come to the brass and to the county for years with allegations of racism and people not being promoted, and we never had an office of diversion and diversity and inclusion, formed in light of that. But I think it's because there was a $20 million price tag.
I was just going to say that. $20 million reasons.
Ultimately, $10 million. And because there was no office before, give him time, let him grow into it. I think everything is probably going to work out fine.
Alvin, Reid.
Yes.
I want to ask you about Caroline Hecker. She's a reporter for KMOV. This week, she was doing a stand-up, live shot in front of City Hall during some of the civil unrest there. That's when there was Camp Cruson. Remember, they had put up couches and basketball hoops and whatnot, and then the police department took it down maybe the second time in 72 hours. So while she's doing her live shot, people came up from behind her with, raising their middle finger, and then someone absconded with her camera. And this is just a week or 10 days after one of her colleagues, Justina Colonel from KSDK, was actually approached by a fellow with a firearm while she was covering some of the civil unrest and the mob demonstrations. I think members of the media should circle the wagons and defend these reporters. And I believe that if they were reporters for the Washington Post, the New York Times, they would get support in the community. And I'm a little disappointed that the local media haven't supported these two women who are trying to do their jobs. What do you say?
I agree with you 100%, 110%, even though I hate that phrase. All right. Because look, if no one else, especially right now, is going to protect us, then we have to protect ourselves. And I come from a school where if that was going down, okay, fellow print reporter and the folks on the broadcast or radio side, that we protected ourselves. We weren't going to have that, okay? And I know it's a different time, but that's absolutely out of the question. And you remember when like the news programs and whatnot used to give themselves like 2 minutes to actually do an editorial? Well, give yourself the 2 minutes to say like, whoever took that camera, whoever punched my reporter, we are going to press on until we find out who did it. So there's nothing wrong. That's outrageous. Don't touch journalists. And journalists, if they do, you better be serious about putting an end to that. This, it's a serious business, and it's not all flighty, and it's too flighty right now. And let's be serious about what we're doing, but also let's be serious about protecting ourselves.
I disagree.
If it had been a Trump supporter, you better believe they would have charges filed. But Black Lives Matter is the most powerful organization on the planet at this moment, and I think newsrooms that are barely staffed they probably don't want to invite that kind of headache, even though that is not old school. I think that they're dealing with challenges that the rest of us are not familiar with.
I disagree, and I'll tell you why. First of all, thank goodness she wasn't injured. I think, and I don't think any differently. If you could say we can do the whataboutism, I think had a Trump supporter jostled her, I can't imagine that I would be all that up in arms. When you take on the job as a TV reporter at a demonstration, with it comes some risks. Think about how little that is compared to what war correspondents do.
Totally different. Now, wait a minute. Hold it, Ray. Now, the Viet Cong shooting at you or Afghanistan, that's something different. And I'm going to be sexist here, okay? I'll be the first to admit it. What are guys doing? You tell them to back up off of that lady. Okay, I don't care if you're black, white, conservative, whatever. Chivalry has been thrown in the chipper. And guys, you got to stand up and say, I'm not having it anymore.
Okay, I just like to finish.
On the other hand, Alvin, it's rough out there, the second shift. I mean, when the night shift comes on protest, and if there was somebody really assaulted and injured, I'd say absolutely. But, I mean, you don't want to start writing stories because people are cursing at the TV reporters or something.
But if they're stealing cameras or jostling people or being physical with them, Bill, that's something altogether different.
I don't think so, because compare again the damage there. I was trying to finish the thought. When you're talking about people having their businesses destroyed and people being seriously injured, I think it makes the media look ridiculous.
But think about this. We're going after the McCloskeys. The McCloskeys brandish firearms, and we're holding them account for 3 weeks.
Charlie,
if a protester brandishes a firearm, why isn't he or she held account for 3 weeks?
Charlie, I'm not talking about whether you hold protesters. That's the laws part. You asked about should the media stick up. There's a lot of media issues in this town where there should be more solidarity between how management treats talent or something. But in terms of this, for the media to get dramatic about the fact that one of our own got jostled at a protest, or whether a Trump person did it, Black Lives Matter, anybody, I think it makes us look like,
it's okay. What if a police officer, Ray? What if a police officer had jostled the camera? What if the police officer had jostled the camera? You'd be rightfully upset.
No, I wouldn't. And my point is, I don't think that getting jostled is, I think the media looks ridiculous.
No, it doesn't. Ray, like I said, I come from a different school, okay? And the state I came from says like, the one where we will draw the line, where is you mess with one of us, we gonna mess with you. And that's lost. Trying to get computer hits and trying to be all cute and carrying on. We better stand up for ourselves, be it in the newsroom, be it in the courtroom, or be it out on the street.
Wendy,
I remember during the Ferguson unrest when one of the photographers, David Carson, went into a store that was being looted and took pictures and was chased down the street. And I don't remember us writing a story about it. I mean, it was just sort of, I think things were really rough out there. And, you know, the fact that somebody gets jostled, as you say, I don't know if we should be circling the wagons and writing about that.
I mean, look,
However, when Mike Falk was kettled, of course we covered Mike Falk when he was kettled, right? But then again, you're right, Bill, because Paul Hampel, I think, was attacked, and that we didn't make a big deal of that at all.
Exactly right.
Hey, Charlie, when Leland Vittert, former St. Louis son of our founder, Mark Vittert, was attacked and chased, it was a legitimate story. And I think it should have been covered because that was a case where he was roughed up physically and he was chased off of covering a protest. That is when the media, and I think they did, frankly, should all stick up for Fox News. That makes sense to me.
CNN did.
The idea that every time one of our TV reporters gets jostled, we want to act like it's a big deal.
Well, they took her camera in the middle of the live shot.
And I don't think that's something newsworthy.
I do.
I do.
We got a minute to go. Wendy Wiese, with a minute to go, Wendy, there was a letter to the editor. I realize it's not an official act of state, but it was to remove the Stan the Man statue outside of Busch Stadium because it really doesn't resemble the great Stan Musial. What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea. I think that he deserves a likeness that is actually a likeness.
Well, call me sentimental, but it's so much a part of the city, having a statue of the most popular guy ever in St. Louis that doesn't even look like it. And yet people are so nice here that they go, oh, that's Stan Musial. And they meet under the statue. Let it stay, Wendy.
I've heard that
shown there is no depth to which a Cub fan will sink.
I've heard 75% of the busts in the Baseball and Professional Football Hall of Fame don't look like the people that they are supposed to. But we're not going to change all those. I like the Stan Musial. Meet under that robotic looking thing that has Stan Musial on it. We've done it for 40 years.
Well, I'll tell you
50 years in my case.
Yeah, it is a landmark, and I think we credit Bob Brigg, the late Bob Brigg of the Post-Dispatch, who came up with the idea after seeing a statue of Honus Wagner outside of Pittsburgh, and it just never really looked like the guy. That's the only problem. Well, in a moment, we're going to talk to Taulby Roach, who is the president and CEO of Bi-State Development, which oversees Metrolink, which has been in the news quite a bit. And he's going to sit on the hot seat and take our questions. So don't go away.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network. Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, for the second half. This is part 2, and we are so glad to welcome the president and the CEO of Bi-State Development, the man who oversees Metrolink, Taulby Roach, kind enough to join us on this edition of Donnybrook. Mr. Roach, welcome aboard. How are you?
Thank you, Charlie. Glad to be here. I'm doing fine.
Good, good, good. Well, you've been in the news a little bit because, as you know, Metrolink was one of the concerns of the Centene CEO, Michael Neidorff, when a couple of weeks ago he said that he's going to build an alternative headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina, and who knows, maybe Centene will move its headquarters there if some things don't improve here. And one thing he mentioned was the security of Metrolink. He mentioned the wife of someone who had been recruited and was considered for a job at a 501c3. She took the Metrolink to downtown St. Louis from Clayton and described it as a very bad experience, so she took a cab back. He says he's offered to buy facial recognition technology for the stops. First question, have you met with him to address some of his concerns?
Absolutely, Charlie. I have met with Mr. Neidorff. I met with him a couple of months ago, and we discussed, of course, what is the new security plan and what are the primary elements of that. And of course, he's very generous in trying to proposed solutions versus Mr. Neidorf is one of those voices we should be listening to. And how can we get better? I was listening to him as to how we can get better, but it's not just his voice we should be listening to. We should also be listening to those voices in the streets who are asking us for social change and looking at those instances. And you know what? I would even posit to this group that Metrolink is one of those solutions. How do we get better as a city? How do we compete with the Charlottes? And one of the ways that we compete with them is we see ourselves in a new way with a safe and secure system that's equitable and fair to all.
And Mr. Roach, before I even start, I have immense respect for anybody in your position who does willingly sit on the hot seat with this rogues gallery. So we thank you. But one of your commissioners, Derek Cox, said that Bi-State had spent an enormous amount of money on a plan or proposals to make it safer, and that we received bad advice. A lot of what you deal with has to, it's discussed openly. Is that a challenge for you? And how did you respond internally when you read Mr. Cox's remarks in the press?
So, of course, it's a challenge. And that's right. I have a 10-person board of commissioners, and I have to respond to them. And they're constantly pushing me and staff to get better. That's reasonable. But look, let's think about what are the victories that we've been able to deliver. And I would note that our new security plan, which was signed on February the 26th, includes a 10-0 vote from that very Board of Commissioners and includes signatures of the county executive, of the mayor of St. Louis, of the county board chairman in St. Clair County, the chief of St. Louis County, the chief of St. Louis City, and the sheriff of St. Louis County. I challenge anyone in St. Louis to show me a document that has all those autographs. And what's that showing the region in answering that question is, are we being proactive? The first challenge was fix the relationships with our true police partners. And so that box is checked. We have more to do, but that box is checked.
Mr. Roach, a few months ago, you were trying to get your board to let you take over the Del Mar trolley. Mm-hmm. And that didn't work out for you. And I remember you saying that if we default on the trolley grant, it's going to be bad for the future trying to get federal money for transportation. I know it's too early to have seen anything like that, but do you really think that this whole trolley thing is going to be some chain that we're going to be carrying around for years now?
So I'm a transportation professional and I work in this area. My career is built behind public assets like Metrolink. And it's true that I was asked to take a look at and put a plan together for the loop trolley, but my board elected that it wasn't right for Bi-State. So they said, no, that's fine. So then I move on. I do my job. But yes, it's true. I work with the FTA all the time. We compete for grants against Indianapolis, against Houston, against Charlotte. And it is true that a default for a region can be seen as a negative. That it is simply a fact. It simply and has to do with my professional opinion. And look, I have an obligation to give you that. And so I did.
Okay.
Taulby, I think it's fair to say that, and I know you've said it actually, there's a widespread perception that Metrolink is unsafe. Would you agree with that? And
Yes.
I guess my question is, how fair is that perception? And now that it's come up, how does our system, from what you know, maybe, I don't know if you can answer this, how does it compare in terms of safety to, say, Charlotte's? Or others like Charlotte's?
So that's right. I mean, so it's a fact that we have a perception issue. I have a perception issue even with the panel. I want to convince everybody on this panel to ride my system. That's my job. In general, we are in the middle of the pack compared to other systems. And I have more data on systems like Indianapolis, on Minneapolis, which is very close because they have light rail, indeed. And we track very closely to those. And that comes from national transportation data from actually 2016 and 2017 years. But the fact is, to use the cliche, perception is reality. And in order for me to rebuild this system, I need all folks, the general public, to have confidence in the system. And the reality is that they don't right now. And I need to get, as I like to tell my staff, we need butts in the seats. We need folks to be on our system. And that means we need to rebuild that confidence. We need to enact a security plan that's professional, thorough, and that is accountable to the public. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. You'll hear me on the radio. I'm going to show up and I'm going to talk about my system and I'm going to be accountable for it.
So I've lived throughout the nation. I've worked at various newspapers, but I was at USA Today the last 4 years before moving back. And people have asked me since I moved back, hey, if you could change St. Louis, what would it be? I said I would physically lift up, their mass transit system, rail, and bring it to St. Louis. So we had ours here when I moved back in 1995. And the first time I ever wrote it, I actually had to ask, so you can just get on this train and not have to go through any kind of, ticket, buy a ticket, whatever. And the first time I said, this will never work. Okay. Now this was in 1995. All right. This is 25 years ago. And we're still at that place. And when you speak of security and when you speak of changing the perception, my thought is that the best way to do that was to make people actually physically pay to get on the train. Why is that not the policy?
Well, I mean, it's a fair critique. And for instance, this is a public system that has to be responsive to what the public is demanding. And for instance, specific with my discussion with Mr. Nydorf was working into a paradigm that makes sense. So a fundamental part of our new security system is to move into an access control environment. So, right, that's right. Our system was designed for a St. Louis version that was in 1995. I think it's fair to say that our city is very different in 2020. And I think what the public is telling us is that they would like to see at least some element of more rigorous fare enforcement. And this fits with making a more secure environment. So we've moved on access control. We're employing access control on a pilot program. We did it at Forest Park, where, for instance, there's a central point of access that is either manned or can be enhanced through physical enhancements like camera systems, where every single patron goes through that gate and is fare checked. If you want an example of an access control station, Cortex is one. Cortex is designed in this fundamental design paradigm that makes sense. There's no question that the public is asking for that. I need to regain the public's trust in our system, so it's reasonable that we change this paradigm. I can't do it overnight, though. It does take time. And so we've started to do the things that need to be done. We've done some bond refinancings to spend some cash out to make it available for this renovation. Remember, our system is 30 years old. It needs some of the fundamental investments so that we make it a safe and secure system, and I intend to do that.
Mr. Roach, to get that confidence, you have a couple of recent incidents that are really going to be problematic, I think. One, of course, is the story in the paper over the weekend where a couple was asked to buy drugs on Metrolink, and when they refused, they got off at the Cortex station, and then they were beaten up by the guy trying to sell them drugs. And then there's the incident on the DeBoliver platform where a couple of teenage girls, 19 years old, got into a brawl. And according to published reports, your security guards just stood and watched them. Can that possibly be true? And if so, how can we regain confidence if these stories are still going on recently?
Sure. So it could definitely possibly be true because the fact is I run an urban system, an urban mass transit system. And some of the problems that we experience in our city are going to show up on my system. Now, what's the question that I need to ask to really respond to the public, to you? And that is, do we have a thorough and professional response? Does it make sense? Does it work within the normal security paradigms that we are? And in that specific incident at the Forest Park station specifically, look, our guards did not act properly. There's no question. We've reviewed the tapes, we've looked at it, and there is an intervention expectation that all security paradigms have, and that wasn't met. We didn't do the job there. But the question is, now, do we just do crisis management No, you go back and you turn back to your system that we've adopted, that we've had our partners sign on to, and we look at it and review it and see how we can do better. In that case, we've done that. We've reviewed the tapes. We've taken action. Unfortunately, those two security guards, they couldn't meet the burden of what we need on the system, and so they've been relieved. But we always need to look at that, see how we can do better, look at our intervention expectations, not only on a security level, but also at a police level with our partners, with St. Louis County, St. Louis City, Sheriff's Department in the city, St. Clair County, and continue to look at ourselves and see how we can do better.
Are we locked into the policy, Mr. Roach, in which only police officers who are aboard Metrolink have weapons and security guards are not armed? Are we locked into that? Is that signed,
Yes.
sealed, delivered?
So we are locked into that policy, mostly because those are the provisions associated with federal law, with the enabling legislation of my agency. So that's simply a fact. But as far as a security paradigm, what's important is to get the right tools in the hands of the right people at the right time. And so, look, we need to be responsive to, I don't need to have a militaristic environment where people feel threatened, but I also want to make them feel safe. So there's that balance between customer service and police presence. Now, we are committed to police presence. I absolutely need the police. I need weapons and firearms on the system, but in the hands of the professionals who are thoroughly trained, who are trained in how to use those weapons. And so that we need to make that investment, and we have.
I feel safe riding Metrolink. Okay, I really do. And I ride it to sporting events. And obviously right now, and I also ride it occasionally, like to go to lunch downtown or something. But the big problem, well, there's two questions. This is a two-part question. One, how devastating has it been to your finances that we don't have sporting events? And how is that impacting your agency? And then the second is, given that a huge problem that certainly predates you is that the Metrolink doesn't go most of where it needs to go in a lot of people's mind. Do you think there's any realistic opportunity to expand it, given the problems you have with perception right now?
Well, on the first part, yes, obviously COVID has been devastating to our ridership. And really, we are down kind of month over month, 19 to 20 comparables, about 50% ridership on Metro Bus and close to 60 to 65% on Metro Link. However, in system design, one thing that I'm sorry, I just can't help but hold on to, but in January and February this year, we had back-to-back positive months in ridership. The first time we've had that in 40 months. And what that is, I think, tells us is that we're on the right track. We're on the right track towards rebuilding the system. Now, obviously, COVID's had its effects. So what we're doing is, and this is my job, is financial stability. So taking the CARES Act funding that we received from the federal government, stabilizing our system over time so that it's still there and healthy for when the economy comes back. So remember, our revenue is supported by sales tax, by the sales tax initiatives, especially in Missouri. So what we've done is we've taken that gap and we're filling it through CARES Act funding right now so that the system is still stable, so that it is there and ready for the public when hopefully they return and we work on our perception issue and continue to provide transit in the greater St. Louis area.
Well, I feel a little foolish asking you about where you'd want to expand, Mr. Roach, when we're having you're pushing the boulder up the hill on this security stuff all the time. Mm-hmm. But if you could expand, if all of a sudden there was a lot of public support and money available, where would you go?
Well, so for instance, and I think the future of what we think our city should be in 2025 and 2030, what's the version that we want to see? And I think what we need to do is listen to the voices of what our community needs. And so one thing about transit is that in our modern world where we seem to get in our own little bubbles and so on, transit is not a bubble. Now we have all comers there in transit. We have folks, nurses, doctors, we have folks stocking shelves. We have everybody comes to transit. So the idea would be that hopefully it goes to all parts of the community. So if there's some communities of need that we go to, I think those are some of the things that we should explore. So that indeed, one of the things, if folks are asking for better equity and access and a better economic future, and I would say they are, maybe we should be looking at what are the things that provide that. And I would say that the future version of St. Louis, a better version of St. Louis, and I'm proud of St. Louis. I was raised in St. Louis. I believe in transit. I think transit has a role to play. So let's look at how we do that. How do we do that in an equitable lens, and how do we make ourselves better?
Mr. Rose, the first time I went to Europe was the first time I actually got introduced to mass transit in Paris and Rome. And they were like, and I understand it was more of a terrorism thing than just a local crime thing. But I mean, they had soldiers on the train. They had machine guns. If they didn't have a machine gun, they had a dog. Okay. And nobody was shocked and nobody was upset. They felt safe. Now, I'm not trying to say we need to go there, but at the same time, I just appreciated the fact that that's the first thing I saw. Like, nothing's going to go down on the train because the train is too important. Now, I just said that because after what you said, but following up on what Bill said, I've always been a believer in that. And I got this from Washington also. Okay, St. Charles said they didn't want the metro. Well, you know what? The Orange Line, which goes out past Vienna and now to Centerville, they didn't want the metro. And places didn't want the metro. And you know what? The metro got built anyway. And now that's where everybody gets on the metro. And that's why the metro is safe. And so I just wonder, why not a plan that gets, quite frankly, affluent people from where they live to downtown St. Louis, and they will use it. They will pay. They will demand that you have to have a card and it has to be put in a machine. So why not try to get the people involved in Metro that would use Metro? It's been proven all over the United States.
Well, and we prove it here every day. I mean, so I would look, let's look at how our city has changed, how the economic center of the city has changed and is modified. What's one of the biggest economic generators and my number one transit station? It's the Central West End station, and look, I invite you to be on my Blue Line train when I'm going home at night. And we see all those millennials of all colors and all socioeconomic groups packed on that platform. Okay, I know you don't see it, Alvin, right now because you don't ride my train, but I got to convince you to.
Well, wait a minute, not to interrupt you, but if the train came to where I lived, that I didn't have to drive to Laclede Station, which is halfway to downtown, I would be on the train. People who live out this way would take the train if there was a train to take.
Well, sure. And it isn't just Taulby Roach's idea, because what we have to do is we have to engender positivity and convince folks these are publicly supported projects. So for instance, I have to add integrity to my system. Number one, before I think I can, cogently say, where are we expanding the systems, is I got to take care of home first. I think I have to be realistic about the perception issue and try to work on that. So that's what we're working on right now. Now, where is the future? I would agree. I think that there's quite a few homes out in the St. Charles area. I think there's quite a few homes that we can access in some of the more remote areas. State support sure wouldn't hurt, I should say. One of the reasons why Illinois has expanded a little more easier is because there is state support for transit. That certainly is a key element. And remember, what we want to talk about, I'm a transportation professional, so not every trip works in transit. It should be part of a transportation system where, yes, some people take roads, some people take buses, some people take bikes. These should all work in concert on a version of St. Louis that makes sense. So you're right. There are some really good points too about what is the consumer's decision of what puts them on transit. We don't do a good enough job on that. We need to have those conversations. Had those conversations with the electeds, with East West Gateway, and I think it's trying to figure out what is the future of our region and how can we support it.
Taulby, we all know there have been way, way, way too many studies done in this town on all subjects. And we on our show have repeatedly debated the most recent one for you, and I'm still recovering from the injuries, trying to defend it. So, can you explain why people should trust still another study? What is it about this study that would make it different? What is it about this study that said take away the drug sniffing guards and the arms from the security guards and don't do turnstiles? Why should people believe this study?
Well, so in this version of the study, I welcome everybody to take a look at it. And there's some hard critiques in there for my agency and for what we've done. But there's some great recommendations where we have looked at what has succeeded in other peer areas. So for instance, part of the study is that we brought in professionals from Washington, D.C., from WMATA, from Minneapolis, and from Portland, to professionals who were in the security area from those different systems, and they came in and did what's called a peer review. It's a great element, very important thing to look at, how we can do things better, be fair critics, and also try to make some suggestions on what worked for them. Now, look, then we take these ideas, the same study, and we vet them and make them ours. This is our city. I mean, look, I would agree with some of the parochialism that we have in St. Louis. It's both our curse and, of course, one of the greatest things that we have about our town. We're loyal to it. But now we take that study and adapt it to the version of St. Louis that makes sense. And I think that there's some really good information in there, and it provides a third-party review of what we're doing. I have to live by a report card. We went through the first one that came through, and it's one of those report cards that you would put on your refrigerator. In fact, it's on my refrigerator because we did well in the first version. So now we need to continue to be reviewed by the study and by East West Gateway and be sure that we're still accountable and making progress.
But isn't it true that people in our region tend to be moving to places like Fenton and Eureka and Wentzville and St. Peter's, and they know that there's no mass transit, and they're voting with their feet and their pocketbooks to go elsewhere. And you got that going on at the same time. I read the Business Journal this week. Jacob Kern interviewed a woman who runs a startup in Cortex. Her name is Allie McClure. She says her firm is not going back to the office anymore. Everyone is going to work at home in the future. So there might be that dynamic that mass transportation from here to New York City and beyond will be dealing with, right?
Well, sure, yes, because our cities and work environment are constantly changing. So as an agency, we should be changing what our products are. So as we went through the example here, how should we change to meet the new security paradigm that should be done in St. Louis? But also, what are the other options for customers that we're offering, whether it be bus, whether it be, for instance, we're doing a pilot program right now with VIA on-demand service that's providing kind of smaller van-sized access. So we're trying to adapt and modernize our system so that it responds to that modern version of St. Louis. So, for instance, one of the things that we're doing is we're doing an app pilot program on how to do contactless fare, and that's of course in response to COVID, but it also gives us that opportunity to look at how we're doing fares and how to modernize our system so that it's responsive to those new jobs.
Mr. Roach, and you'll have to forgive me if I seem like a pit bull with a bone, but I have to circle back to that DeBoliver platform incident. You were quoted in the paper as saying that a security guard with a gun could have actually escalated the situation, and that there's no proof that it would have helped keep it from happening in the first place. With all due respect, how can you be sure?
We've got about a minute to go, Taulby.
Yes, so I just use that as an incident. So as awful as that incident is the use of deadly force warranted? And I have professionals in this area. As a matter of fact, my field security general is Kevin Scott, good man from Baldwin, and he's a professional in this area, and he knows a firearm would not have helped that individual situation. So What we need to do is work on principles of de-escalation and making systems comfortable and safe. Those are challenges, and we're trying to thread that needle.
Well, Taulby Roach, we want to thank you very much for joining us for Donnybrook Part 2. We sure appreciate the help that you gave us to enlighten us about Metrolink and Bi-State, and we hope that with this goodbye, we can get you to come back sometime in the future.
Anytime. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Taulby Roach from Bi-State and Metrolink. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week at this time.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.